Welcome back. Here we go again. So this is part 2 of Why Babies Suddenly Cry. And the first part we talked very much about the different parts of the baby's brain and how that is and why that they live very much in the most primitive parts of their brain, where they're just reacting to the sensory input, and that this part of the brain is less developed, and this is their decision making, their rationalisation, their executive function, and that's not very well developed. As a parent, it can be really hard to think long term when you're doing the parenting, when you're responding to the immediate demands of your baby. It's really important these first couple of years, because this really does build your baby's brain, and it builds a brain that is, and their responses and their experiences in these first 2 years really are very formative. They form the baby's brain. Now, it doesn't mean to say none of us are perfect, okay? None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes to our parenting. We all react in ways that we wouldn't want to, and we all have to make compromises. And we are all trying to do our best. But if you know a little bit about some of these things that affect your baby's brain, how you can help your baby's brain grow best, then that can help you when you're dealing with the immediate situations and how you respond to them. And this is important when we're thinking about why babies cry and what we can do about it. So I'm talking about oxytocin. Hooray for oxytocin. Oxytocin, a wonderful, wonderful hormone. Oxytocin is the hormone of love. You release oxytocin when you fall in love, when you cuddle your babies. You release oxytocin when you are in labour. It makes the muscles contract. So you know when you're in love and it feels like your heart's contracting. It is. It really is. Your heart is having a good squeeze. And you do feel it in your heart. Or if you're really I've lost my train of thought, pardon me. We also release oxytocin when we're breastfeeding. There's tiny little slithers of muscle around each of the milk cells, and when we're feeding our baby, the brain causes the oxytocin to be released, and the little slithers of muscle squeeze and the milk comes out of the milk cells. And sometimes you can feel it with the letdown. We also release oxytocin when we have sex and we orgasm. Oxytocin is vital. There's huge amounts of research about oxytocin at the moment. They're looking at doing oxytocin sprays in prisons for reducing violence. They're looking at oxytocin for helping with all sorts of things like that. So oxytocin is really, really powerful and wonderful hormone. And why it's relevant to your babies is because oxytocin helps the brain grow. It's talked about as the fertilizer for the brain. So the more oxytocin, the more your baby's brain can grow. And if you looked at some of the links that I talked about last time, the Harvard Center for the Developing Child, if you Google that and you find, and there's ones that you can look at, and it talks about brain architecture and serve and return, and the positive effects of oxytocin. So oxytocin is released. One of the easiest ways to get oxytocin released is skin to skin with your baby. And mums can do skin to skin and dads can do skin to skin. Skin to skin is not just for newborn babies. It's not just for the moments after the birth. At any time you're having a very stressed baby or you're having a stressed day, strip them down to their nappy, take your top off, pop your baby there, wrap yourselves up and have a bit of skin to skin time. That time in the middle of the night where you're pacing up and down because you can't get them to sleep, do some skin to skin. Skin to skin really is a magic. And so oxytocin is released. And do you know we have oxytocin receptors on our chest and our neck? Why we like those snuggy cuddles and kisses when we're falling in with our partner or we're falling in love. We like those kisses and the cuddles. 20-second hug releases oxytocin. So if you have somebody in your family perhaps who's having a particularly tough time, or they're down, depressed, give them a hug. Give them a hug. It releases oxytocin. Oxytocin is also released when we are smiling and when we're feeling loved. So how we respond, so in our touch, in our cuddles and our response, and that proper connection, so eye contact, touch, having an open heart and saying I love you and I care about you. Not just so when you're changing your baby's nappy, you can get the releasing oxytocin by you smile and you talk to them and the baby feels loved and secured, rather than just chatting to somebody else while you do your nappy change. And we all do that sometimes, but it's just being a bit more mindful, but a mindful parenting about maximising the amount of oxytocin that you can give your baby, because it really does grow the brain. And they know this because they look at babies and children and adults who didn't get that lots of oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is released when we're in normal reaction. When we are not, we haven't fight or flight. When we go to fight or flight, then we release cortisol into the brain, and cortisol is a stress hormone. And cortisol and oxytocin don't go together. Cortisol, if there's high levels of cortisol, there are low, it squashes the oxytocin. We don't release the oxytocin if there are high levels. But as we release oxytocin, stress, cortisol goes, the levels of stress hormone cortisol go down. And where there is stress, the brain doesn't grow. The connections aren't made. And, they've, unfortunately, very sad, they've done brain scans of children who are very neglected. So this is very severe neglect. And there are actually gaps. The brain's, for starters, isn't as big. And I mean substantially. There is a classic photograph that goes around. It's on the front of the Graham Allen report. If you want to look that up, you can see the front of it is 2 pictures of brain scans. And one was the brain scan of a normal 3-year-old. And another one was the brain scan of a 3-year-old who'd suffered extreme neglect. And there was a significant difference in the size of the brains. And the brain of the normal 3-year-old was much, much bigger. But also the brain of the severely neglected child, there were gaps. There were actual black patches where there's nothing. So all this stuff doesn't happen, and we can see children who don't get the brain development. You see it in schools. They can't, this bit doesn't work very well. They're not very good at waiting. They're not very good at understanding other people. They're not very good at regulating themselves because they haven't learnt. They haven't had the experienced boss come in and show them what to do. So their boss doesn't really get very good. And they're not very good. Sometimes the language isn't very developed, and their physical coordination is not necessarily very coordinated. And that's not, you can get children and have other things that are happening. That's not necessarily, if they have those things, doesn't necessarily mean that they were neglected. But it does, you do see that the long-term effects. And for babies too, so if you go to there and you look at the toxic stress one, and that explains how not only does when there is stress in the baby's brain, their brain's not growing, but it actually can cause some damage to what's there. So it's really important we try and keep stress levels down for the babies, for their long-term brain growth. I'm waffling on a bit now and I'm moving on. But key to oxytocin And key to keeping the stress levels down is for the babies to feel really, really secure, and for them to have a strong attachment to key people. Now, it doesn't have to just be the mum. It often is the strongest attachments to the mother, and actually that's a really good thing. If they only want to be with mum, actually that's a really good thing for their brain. But they will have secondary attachments that are really important too. And so dads and grandparents and childminders can form those important bonds and those important attachments. We bond with the baby, they're attached to us. And that attachment allows them to go on and be strong and to release their oxytocin and be happy. And I'm going to stop here now and I'm going to start part 3. I'm going to talk about some of the other things that affect the baby and why babies suddenly cry.